She was 8 months pregnant, alone on the kitchen floor, bleeding out. Her husband said he was in London. He was 20 minutes away with another woman. And that woman? She had a ring on her finger, a $200,000 ring he never gave his own wife. By the time Rachel survived that night, she had lost everything: her baby, her money, her freedom, even her mind, according to the court. But here is what Marcus Bennett never counted on. The woman who woke up from that hospital bed was not the woman he married. She was something far more dangerous, and she was coming for everything. Stay with me, because in the next hour, you will watch one woman dismantle a billionaire's empire using nothing but the truth, a USB drive, and a mother-in-law he told the world was dead. This story is not just about revenge. It is proof that no matter how powerful someone is, they cannot buy their way out of the truth forever. If that is something you needed to hear today, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week, we bring you stories that remind you just how strong you really are.
It started with a 911 call, crackling to life at 11:47 on a Saturday night. My brother's voice, shaking with a terror I can still hear in my memory. He told them, "My sister is 8 months pregnant. There's blood everywhere. Please send someone now." The dispatcher, bless her, was calm and steady. "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line. What is your location?" 427 Whitmore Drive, in Greenwich, Connecticut. The Bennett estate. He begged them to hurry, telling them I wasn't moving. "Is she breathing?" she asked. He told me later there was a pause as he leaned in close to my face. "Yes, barely. But there's so much blood. Oh God, so much." "Help is on the way, ma'am," she said. "Stay with her." That call, it was the first tremor of an earthquake that would change all of our lives. Because there I was, bleeding on the floor of my supposed dream home, about to learn that my entire life was a lie, and the man who promised to love me, well, he wasn't in London closing a deal. He was just 20 minutes from me, wrapped up with someone else. Just 12 hours before all that, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. At 32, I had what everyone dreamed of: a gorgeous home in Connecticut, the kind you see in magazines, a husband worth over $2 billion, and our little girl was due in just 4 weeks. Her nursery was already perfect: soft pinks and creams, with tiny clothes and drawers that cost a fortune. I used to have an old Honda, you know. But Marcus insisted I get something safer for the baby, so he gave my car away without even asking me. "It's just a car," he'd said when I got upset. "I'm trying to protect our family." That was him, always protecting, always in control, always knowing best. That afternoon, I was in our huge living room, arranging white roses for the baby shower we were having in a few hours. 30 of my closest friends were supposed to come celebrate our little Emma. Well, mostly they were the wives of his friends. My own friends had slowly disappeared over the years I was married. Diane was the only one left, and even she would say how I never seemed to have time anymore. Then the first contraction hit me while I was moving a gift table. I gasped, my hand flying to my belly, but I just laughed. Braxton Hicks, I thought. I'd been having them for weeks, and my doctor said it was perfectly normal. The second one came 5 minutes later. It was much stronger. I put down a vase I was holding and tried to breathe through it. I figured I was just overdoing it. I'd been up all morning, wanting the decorations to be absolutely perfect. Marcus, of course, had offered to hire a team to do everything, but I needed to do it myself. It was one of the last things in my life that actually felt like it was mine. I took out my phone to send him a text, just to feel like he was there with me, even an ocean away. "Hey, honey, shower's coming together beautifully. Missing you. Call when you can." I remember just staring at my phone, hoping to see those little dots appear, showing me he was typing. But there was nothing. He was supposed to be in London, expanding his company. He'd been gone for 3 days and had sworn he'd call. But every time I tried, it went straight to his voicemail. For For 2 whole days, it had been like that. Important negotiations, his assistant, Jennifer, had told me. He asked not to be disturbed. Then the third contraction hit, and it dropped me to my knees. There was no mistaking this one. The pain was like a fire spreading through me, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. I grabbed onto the gift table, trying to hold myself up, and that's when I saw it. There was blood on the white marble floor. So much blood. I screamed, but the caterers were in the kitchen on the other side of that enormous house, and no one heard me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely use my phone. My vision was already going fuzzy. I tried Marcus first. Voicemail. I tried Jennifer. No answer. With the very last bit of my strength, I called the one person I knew would drop everything. Your Uncle Tyler. Something is wrong, I choked out when he answered. The baby? There's so much blood. Rach, where are you? Home? I whispered. Tyler, I think I'm dying. The phone just fell from my hand as another wave of pain hit. I could hear his voice, sounding so small and far away, screaming my name before everything just went dark. Your Uncle Tyler. He must have broken every speed limit, getting from Queens to Greenwich. He's a construction guy, not some billionaire. He drove this old pickup truck that had rust all over it. The police should have pulled him over for going 90 in a 55, but I guess they saw the look on his face and knew to leave him alone. He never liked Marcus, you know. From the first time I brought him home, Tyler felt something was off. Too slick, he'd say. Too perfect. But I was so head over heels in love, so sure I'd found my prince. And Tyler, being the good brother he is, he just kept his thoughts to himself to support me, even when it made his own skin crawl. He let himself in with the emergency key I'd given him years before, back when my life was normal, and I lived in a small Brooklyn apartment. The moment he opened that door, his heart just stopped. He found me crumpled on the floor, surrounded by a sea of red. He said my face was white as a sheet, and I was barely breathing. He dropped right to his knees beside me, but he was so scared, he didn't know what to do. He couldn't figure out how to stop the bleeding. All he knew was his little sister was dying. The paramedics finally got there, 7 minutes later, but he said it felt like an eternity. They were so efficient, getting me onto a stretcher, yelling all this medical stuff Tyler didn't understand. Someone was asking him about my medical history, another about allergies, and then a third person asked where my husband was. That question, he said, was like a punch to the gut. Where was Marcus? As the ambulance sirens wailed on the way to the hospital, Tyler tried his phone again. Voicemail. Jennifer's phone, voicemail. He even tried the main office number for Bennett Technologies, only to get a recording about being closed for the weekend. I was bleeding to death, and my billionaire husband was nowhere to be found. Something was terribly wrong. There was this surgeon, Dr. Patricia Williams. She'd been doing this for 23 years, and she had a way of delivering awful news with kindness, but never with false hope. She found Tyler in the waiting room, still in his dusty work clothes, with my blood on his hands. Mr. Morrison, she began. I sat down next to him, introducing myself as Dr. Williams, the physician caring for his sister. Tyler shot straight up, asking if she and the baby were all right. With a gentle gesture, Dr. Williams urged him to sit. Her dark eyes were kind, but held a serious weight. She explained that his sister had a severe placental abruption, where the placenta detaches early, causing a massive internal bleed. The world seemed to shift under Tyler's feet. He asked her to clarify. We have to perform an emergency C-section right now, she said. The baby is in distress, and Rachel is bleeding out faster than we can manage. The doctor paused, letting the gravity of the words sink in. I won't sugarcoat this, she added. It's a life-threatening crisis for both of them. But you can save them, can't you? Both of them? We'll do everything in our power, but I need your consent on these forms. You're listed as her emergency contact. Tyler just stared at her, repeating, I'm her emergency contact? What about her husband? Dr. Williams' expression showed a flicker of what looked like disapproval. According to our files, you're the primary contact. We haven't been able to reach Mr. Bennett. With trembling hands, Tyler signed the papers. As Rachel was wheeled behind the operating room doors, he collapsed into a plastic chair, phone in hand. He tried calling Marcus again, but it went straight to voicemail. A knot formed in Tyler's stomach. Marcus Bennett was many things, and not all of them were good, but he was never out of touch. His whole business was built on being available 24/7. The thought of him being unreachable during a real family crisis seemed unbelievable. Unless he wasn't where he said he would be, Tyler opened the Find My Friends app Rachel had made them all download ages ago, back when their mom was still around and always worried. Rachel's icon was right there at the hospital, which made perfect sense. Tyler's was in the same spot, obviously, but Marcus's icon placed him in Stamford, Connecticut. Not in London, not on a plane over the ocean, but in Stamford, just a 20-minute drive away. Tyler just stared at his phone, his exhausted mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. It had to be a mistake. Maybe Marcus was at a private airport, or his phone was pinging the wrong cell tower. There had to be a simple, logical reason, but Tyler had been a soldier before he started working in construction. He'd learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming that Marcus Bennett was exactly where the app showed him, doing something he had no business doing while his wife's life was on the line. Tyler took a screenshot of the map and saved it. Then he settled in for the long wait. The surgery stretched on for 5 hours, with Tyler pacing the waiting room like a trapped animal. He survived on vending machine coffee that tasted like acid, ignoring calls from family who'd heard the baby shower was off. Finally, at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, Dr. Williams came out. Her scrubs were stained, but her face was lit by a smile. She made it, Dr. Williams said. It was a close call. A very close call, but your sister is a fighter. Tyler felt tears run down his face before he even knew he was crying. And the baby? Your niece is tiny, but she's tough. 4 pounds and 2 ounces. She'll be in the NICU for a few weeks, but her vitals look good. She's a fighter, just like her mom. Can I see them? He asked. Rachel's still out, but you can see the baby. Tyler followed the doctor through a labyrinth of hallways to the NICU. Through the glass, he saw rows of incubators, each holding a tiny person hooked up to machines. Dr. Williams pointed to one. That's Emma. Tyler pressed his hand against the cool glass. The baby was so incredibly small, her skin looking almost see-through. Her little chest rose and fell with each tiny breath. She had a full head of dark hair, just like Rachel's. Your mom's going to be okay, little one, Tyler whispered. And I promise I'll make sure your dad gets here, even if I have to drag him here myself. But first, he had to figure out where Marcus Bennett really was. Diane Torres showed up at the hospital at 3 in the morning, still in her pajamas under a coat. Tyler, what on earth is going on? She cried, rushing over with worried eyes. I saw Rachel's text about the shower, and then nothing. I've been calling for hours. She collapsed, he told her. Placental abruption. They had to do an emergency C-section. Oh my God, Diane whispered, sinking into a chair. Is she okay? Is the baby okay? They're both going to pull through. But Diane, I have to show you something. Tyler took out his phone and showed her the screenshot of Marcus's location. Diane looked at it for a long, silent moment. That's not London. No, it isn't, he said. Where is it? Stamford, some apartment complex, right off exit 5. Diane's face hardened. That son of a bitch. I don't want to jump to conclusions, Tyler started, even though he already had. Maybe there's a reason. Tyler, she said, the only reason for a married man to be in some random apartment in Stamford while his wife is nearly dying is the one we're both thinking of. Tyler knew she was right. He'd known it the second he saw the dot on the map, but he needed proof. Rachel deserved that much. I know a guy, Diane said after a moment. A private investigator. He's not cheap, but he's the best. He's the one who found my ex-husband's secret bank accounts. How not cheap, he asked. More than a construction worker from Queens can probably afford, she admitted. But then she pulled out her phone. Luckily for you, she said, a paralegal with a serious grudge against cheating husbands knows how to work out a payment plan. Marcus Bennett strolled into Greenwich Hospital at 9:15 the next morning looking every bit the concerned billionaire husband. He carried a huge bouquet of white roses and wore a look of practiced concern. His suit was perfect, his hair was perfect, and his shoes probably cost more than Tyler's rent. Rachel, my God, Marcus said, sweeping into the room as if he owned it, which, Tyler thought, he might actually, given the Bennett name, on the new wing. I came the second I heard. Rachel was awake by then, pale and weak, but she was alert. She'd been asking for Marcus since she woke up, certain he was sick, with worry. Tyler watched his sister's face light up at the sight of her husband, and he felt something inside him just break. Marcus, Rachel breathed. You're here. Of course I'm here, Marcus said, kissing her forehead and placing a hand gently on her cheek. I was on the first flight out of London the minute Jennifer told me. The satellite phones were down during my meetings, so I had no idea anything was wrong. The lie was so polished, so flawlessly delivered, that if Tyler hadn't seen the location data himself, he might have bought it. Have you seen Emma? Rachel asked. Not yet. I wanted to see you first. How are you feeling? Tyler slipped out of the room, unable to watch Marcus play the part of the doting husband for another minute. In the hall, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Diane. My guy can meet us tomorrow. He says he can find out exactly where Marcus was and who he was with. But, Tyler, are you sure you want to do this? Once Rachel knows, there's no turning back. Tyler looked through the window at his sister, who was smiling faintly at the man who had left her alone while she almost died. He typed his reply with steady hands. Do it. She deserves the truth. Carl Mendez looked nothing like a private investigator. In his faded jeans and a Yankees hoodie, sipping a coffee from a bodega, he could have been any other middle-aged man killing time in a diner, but his eyes gave him away. They were sharp, always scanning the room, the eyes of a man who'd spent a lifetime observing people. So, Carl said, sliding into the booth across from Tyler and Diane, you think your brother-in-law is cheating on your sister while she's in the hospital with their premature baby? Tyler just nodded grimly. I know how it sounds. It sounds like every case I've worked for the past 30 years, Carl said with a shrug. Rich guys cheating isn't exactly new. The only question is how careful he's being. He was at an apartment in Stamford the night she almost died, Diane interjected. His phone showed him there. Carl's eyebrow went up. You have location data? It all began in this little private investigator's office, you know. Carl, he pulled out this old, worn-out notebook and just said, tell me everything. For the next hour, Diane and I laid out the whole story about Marcus Bennett. His company, his obsessive work schedule, those business trips that just seemed to happen more and more often. Then we talked about the young woman he'd hired about 18 months earlier, Victoria Chase. Diane put it best, I think. She said, she's 27, looks like she walked off a runway, and Marcus talks about her, like she invented the internet. Carl just wrote her name down and asked how your Aunt Rachel felt about her. I remember thinking about it. Rachel just thought the woman was brilliant, that she had a vision nobody else could see. Carl just sort of snorted at that. "Oh, I bet she has vision," he said, "and I bet that vision is about 6 feet tall." And with that, he snapped his notebook shut. "Give me a week," he told me. "I'll find out exactly what your boy Marcus has been up to." It didn't even take a week. 3 days later, my phone rang. "Your brother-in-law hasn't set foot in London in 6 months," Carl said, his private jet. Tail number November 787 Romeo Mike. Was filed to fly to Heathrow, but the plan was changed twice. I asked him where he really went, first to Los Angeles, then to Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. He landed there the very night your aunt collapsed. I felt my blood pressure just shoot through the roof. "It gets better," Carl said. Immigration records showed 2 people on that flight, Marcus Bennett and Victoria Chase. They checked into a resort called Casa del Mar, the presidential suite, for 4 nights. I had to close my eyes. I think a part of me knew this was coming, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch right to the gut. "There's more," Carl said. "I have a contact in Cabo." This contact was a photographer. See? The kind who sells pictures to celebrity magazines. He got photos. "What kind of pictures?" I asked. Carl's voice was grim. "The kind that would make your sister's divorce lawyer very happy." When I saw them spread across his desk, my heart just sank. There was Marcus and Victoria walking hand in hand on some private beach. Victoria feeding Marcus strawberries at dinner. Marcus kissing her neck while she just laughed, head thrown back like she didn't have a care in the world. But the worst one, the one that really twisted the knife, was from the resort spa. You could see Marcus's wedding band, clear as day, on a table. And on Victoria's left hand, catching the Mexican sunlight, was an engagement ring that must have cost an absolute fortune. I remember zooming in. "That ring is huge," I said, "at least 5 carats. Carl confirmed it. "Custom setting. A jeweler friend of mine says it cost somewhere north of $200,000. Rachel's engagement ring had been beautiful, but nothing close to that. Marcus had always made a big show of saying, "Haman." He wanted to upgrade her ring someday, when the company was doing better. Turns out, he did get an upgrade, just not for your Aunt Rachel. "When did he propose to Rachel?" Carl asked me. 2.5 years ago, I said. "Well," he answered, "he proposed to Victoria 3 weeks ago, at a private dinner in Malibu. I have the receipt. He ordered a $9,000 bottle of champagne." I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just some fling. It was a whole other life. Marcus was building a future with this woman, while his wife, pregnant with his child, sat at home believing every single one of his lies. "She has to know," I said. Carl nodded slowly. "She does," he agreed. "But here's the thing about news like this. Timing is everything. Your sister just had major surgery. Her baby's in intensive care. If you tell her now, it could destroy her." I knew what he meant, but if I waited, Marcus would have more time to cover his tracks. Carl leaned back in his chair, back in. "So," he said, "you have to decide what's more important right now, justice or your sister's health." It felt like an impossible choice, and honestly, I didn't know what to do. But in the end, Rachel made the decision for me. When I got to the hospital that afternoon, she was sitting up in bed, and something about her was different. She had color in her cheeks, and a look in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Close the door." I did what she asked, my heart just pounding in my chest. "I've been thinking," she went on, "about the night I collapsed. About Marcus being impossible to reach. About how he just happened to catch the first flight back from London the moment he heard. I tried to get her to rest, but she wasn't having it. "I'm done resting," she said, and her voice was so steady. "I've been lying in this bed for 3 days doing nothing but thinking, and things just aren't adding up." "What do you mean?" I asked. She told me how he claimed he was in crucial meetings, that communications were down, that he came straight from the airport. But then she shook her head. Tyler, I know my husband. When he gets off a long flight, he's a wreck. His clothes are wrinkled. He has that stale airplane smell. But when he showed up here, he looked perfect. Fresh suit, perfect hair, like he'd just stepped out of the shower. Her eyes met mine, and I saw the question in them. He wasn't in London, was he? I only hesitated for a second. Then I took out my phone and showed her everything. The location screenshot, the photographs. I watched her face as she looked at each one. First, she was confused. Then it was disbelief. And then this quiet, hollow shock set in that was so much worse than screaming would have been. That's not possible, she whispered, just staring at that picture of Marcus kissing Victoria on the beach. He was in London. There has to be an explanation. Rach, I said gently, the flight records don't lie. She just kept scrolling, and when she got to the one showing Victoria's engagement ring, found. Her hand went straight to her own wedding ring. It was a beautiful, modest 3-carat diamond that had seemed so huge to us 3 years ago. Next to Victoria's, though, it looked almost tiny. He proposed to her, Rachel said, her voice flat. While I was carrying his child, he proposed to another woman. I remember she said that 3 weeks ago, in Malibu. For a long moment, she was just silent. Then she closed my phone and handed it back. I want to see Emma, she said. I tried to tell her we should talk, call a lawyer, something. I need to see my daughter. As I helped her into the wheelchair, I recognized that tone in her voice. It was the same quiet determination she'd had when our dad left, all those years ago. The same tone she used when she decided to work her way through college waiting tables, and when she built her career from scratch before Marcus talked her into giving it all up. The Rachel Morrison from before she was Rachel Bennett, she was a fighter. And I was finally starting to see that woman again. In the NICU, Rachel just pressed her hands against Emma's incubator and started to cry. But these weren't sad tears, you know. They were tears of pure rage. He knew, she said, her voice so soft. When I called him 2 days before I collapsed, to tell him I wasn't feeling well, he knew. He knew he was going to Mexico with her. He kissed me goodbye that morning, Tyler. He told me he loved me. And the whole time, he was planning to propose to someone else. I just watched as my sister's face changed right before my eyes. The naive girl who had trusted so blindly was just gone. In her place was someone harder, more focused. How long do you think this has been going on? She asked me. I told her Carl was still looking into it, but based on the flight records, they'd taken at least 6 trips together in the last year, always when Marcus claimed he was traveling for work. Rachel was quiet for a few minutes, her hand just resting on the incubator. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger. I want to know everything, every trip. Every lie, she said. Every single dollar he spent on her. I want receipts, photos, bank records, everything. I tried to tell her to focus on getting better, that all this could wait. No, it can't, she said. She turned to look at me, and I saw a strength in her eyes I had never seen before. Because he's going to come back here, she said, and he's going to have an explanation for all of it. He's going to make me feel crazy for ever doubting him. He's going to twist this around and somehow make it my fault. I knew she was right. Marcus was a master at that, at making you question your own sanity. But if I have proof, she continued, if I have evidence that he can't deny or explain away, then I'll have power. For the first time in 3 years, I will have power. I asked her what she was going to do. She looked back at little Emma, sleeping through all the noise. I'm going to protect my daughter, she said, and I'm going to make sure Marcus Bennett pays for every single lie. 2 weeks later, Rachel finally got out of the hospital. Emma still had a few more weeks to go in the NICU, but your aunt was finally well enough to leave. She didn't go back to that big mansion in Greenwich, though. Instead, she checked into a hotel right near the hospital, telling everyone it was to be close to Emma. But the real reason was simpler and sadder. She just couldn't stand the thought of going back to that house, where, where every room was a memory of a life she now knew was a lie. Diane helped her get settled in, bringing food and wine and that kind of tough, no-nonsense friendship that Rachel needed so badly right then. I remember Diane pouring 2 big glasses of Pinot Noir. "So," she said, "what's the plan?" Rachel took a sip. "First," she said, "I need a lawyer. A good one. Someone who handles high-asset divorces and isn't afraid of a billionaire." Diane just grinned from ear to ear. "Girl," she said, "I have been waiting 3 years for you to say that." I remember thinking I'd hit rock bottom, and then my sister said she knew exactly who I needed. Helena Cross. She was everything I could have hoped for. At 48, she had earned her reputation as Manhattan's sharpest divorce lawyer by never blinking when facing down powerful men and their high-priced legal teams. Her office was a gallery of her victories, newspaper clippings about settlements she'd won against wealthy husbands who had made the mistake of underestimating her. "Your case is a complete mess," she told me right away in her midtown office. "But it's a mess with possibilities." I asked her what she meant. "Well, the affair gives us some leverage," she said, "especially since he abandoned you during a health crisis. But," she sighed, "you signed a prenuptial agreement that's basically ironclad." My heart just sank. That prenup was something Marcus insisted on. I was so in love back then, I signed it without even reading it, never imagining I'd actually need to. "So, what could possibly make the circumstances not normal?" I asked her. Helena explained, "If we can show that the marriage was a fraud from the start, or prove Marcus was already being dishonest when you signed that thing, we might have a shot at getting it tossed out completely." The investigator had already found that Marcus's trips with Victoria went back 18 months, which was before our Emma was even conceived. I saw a little spark in Helena's eyes, then, "That helps," she said, "but we need more. We need financial records proving he was hiding assets, proof that he was already planning to leave you while keeping you in the dark about the family's real finances." I couldn't imagine how we'd get that. But then Helena smiled, and it was the smile of a hunter. "We let him think he's already won," she said. "Then we watch him get sloppy." The plan she laid out was incredibly risky, but also brilliant. I would have to play the part of the broken wife, thankful for any crumbs Marcus decided to offer. I was to act like my only concern was Emma's health, not fighting over money. In the background, Helena's team would be digging into Bennett Technologies' finances, and our investigator, Carl, would keep looking into Victoria's past. My job was to collect any little piece of evidence I could find from inside our life together. "The whole trick," Helena told me, "is making them think you're no longer a threat. Rich men like Marcus just expect women like you to take what they're offered instead of fighting and risking it all." She said we had to use his own arrogance against him. "But what if he's right?" I asked. "What if I fight and I lose it all?" Helena leaned in close. "Then you lose it with your head held high, and your daughter will always know her mother was brave enough to fight for what was right." I thought of little Emma, so tiny and frail in her incubator. I thought about the security and stability I wanted to give her. I wanted to be a mother who didn't just let people walk all over her. "When do we start?" I asked. Helena's smile returned. "We already have." That night, I went back to our Greenwich house for the first time since I'd collapsed. Marcus was there in the living room, with a bottle of champagne cooling in a silver bucket. His smile was so warm, the perfect picture of a husband who was just thrilled to have his wife back home. "I thought we should celebrate," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Emma's doing so well, and you're finally home from the hospital." "How thoughtful," I said, taking the glass, but not taking a sip. I'd learned over the years that Marcus's grand gestures usually meant he was feeling guilty about something. "I've been thinking about our future," he went on, "about the kind of life we want for Emma." I put on my most hopeful expression. "Oh?" I said. "I know all my travel has been hard on us." "So," he said, "I'm thinking of changing my role at the company. I'm going to promote Victoria to Chief Operating Officer. She's been handling most of the daily stuff anyway, and she's just brilliant. It would give me more time to be here with you and Emma." I felt my stomach clench. He was basically offering to give his mistress a promotion and acting like it was some noble sacrifice for his family. "That sounds like a huge job for someone so young," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Age is nothing when you have vision," he said. "Victoria can see the future of tech in a way most people just can't." "I'm sure she can," I replied. He completely missed the edge in my voice. "Actually," he added, "I thought you might want to meet her properly. She's been asking about you, worried about your health." The nerve of it all was just staggering, but I just smiled and nodded, playing my part. "Maybe when I'm feeling a little stronger," I said. "Of course, no rush." Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down at it with a look I knew all too well, that little secret smile of his. "I have to take this," he said. "Business emergency." He walked out to the terrace, and through the glass, I could hear bits of his conversation. It wasn't business. It was quiet laughter and sweet nothings. When he came back, his face was a blank mask again. "Sorry about that," he said. "Crisis over." I went up to bed early, saying I was tired, but I just lay there awake for hours listening to the muffled sound of his voice as he kept talking to Victoria. The battle had officially begun, and for the first time, I was ready to fight. About 3 weeks after I got out of the hospital, I got the call I'd been praying for. Helena called me at 7 in the morning. Her voice, usually so calm, was buzzing with energy. "We got him," she said. "Bennett Technologies has been funneling money into offshore accounts for the last 2 years. Shell companies, hidden funds, tax schemes that are right on the edge of being illegal." My heart was pounding. "How much money?" I asked. "A conservative guess? $50 million. Money that should have been part of your marital assets. With this," she said, "we can tear up that prenup and go after half of everything, including all that hidden cash." "So I can protect Emma's future?" I asked, hardly daring to believe it. "More than that," Helena replied. "You can make sure Marcus actually faces some consequences for what he's done." I felt almost lightheaded with relief. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I could actually see a way out. A way to provide for my daughter without depending on the man who had betrayed me so completely. "What's next?" "I'm filing the paperwork this afternoon," she said. "An emergency motion to freeze every asset of Bennett Technologies. By tomorrow morning, Marcus won't be able to move a single dime without a judge's permission." That evening, I actually let myself celebrate. Diane brought champagne, and Tyler brought pizza. We had just heard that Emma was well enough to be moved out of the NICU the next week. It felt like things were finally falling into place. "To karma finally doing its job," Diane said, raising her glass. "To my sister," Tyler added, "who's about to take that snake for every penny he's got." I smiled, and it was a real smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. "To Emma," I said, "and to our new beginning." We ate and laughed, and for a few hours, I almost forgot about the betrayal and the pain. I checked the NICU video feed on my phone and saw Emma sleeping peacefully, getting stronger every single day. I told myself everything was going to be okay. But the next morning, a phone call came that just blew my world apart. Mrs. Bennett? It was Jennifer, Marcus's assistant. Her voice sounded so stiff. Mr. Bennett needs you at the house right away. There are some papers you need to sign. What kind of papers? I asked. I'm sorry, I can't say, but it's urgent. A shiver went down my spine, even though the hotel room was warm. Something felt terribly wrong. Marcus never needed me to sign anything urgently. His lawyers handled all that. I'll be there in an hour, I told her. I tried calling Helena on the drive to Greenwich, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Diane, then Tyler, voicemail, voicemail. By the time I drove up to that big, imposing house, my hands were trembling. Marcus was waiting for me in the formal living room, but he wasn't by himself. There was a woman I'd never seen before, sitting next to him on that white sofa. She was older, very elegant, with that polished look that spoke of expensive lawyers and even more expensive threats. And standing behind them was a police officer. Rachel, Marcus said, his voice just dripping with fake concern. Please sit down. We have to talk. It all started on a perfectly normal afternoon. You know, which is how these things always begin. Strangers were in our living room. Marcus introduced one of them as Margaret Ellis, a supervisor from the court. A supervisor for what? I asked. He put on this sad, practiced face and sighed. Rachel, he said, I didn't want this. But your behavior is a risk to Emma. I felt the whole world just fall away from under me. My behavior? He started listing things, my paranoid accusations, hiring a detective, believing he was having an affair. It was all true, but he made it sound like madness. He didn't seem to care about his own role in all of it. The court, he said, has ordered you can't see our daughter until you have a psychiatric evaluation. My access was being restricted? She was my baby. She'll be safe with me while you get help, he said, reaching for me like he was my loving husband. I remember just flinching away from his touch. Don't you touch me, I told him. And that woman, Margaret, she just wrote on her little clipboard, noting it down as paranoid avoidance. She said I had proof he was unfaithful, and he just asked, so calmly, what proof? Proof he was at a colleague's apartment? Proof he had business dinners? He twisted everything. Marcus just spread his hands out, so innocently. What photos? What flights? He claimed he'd been in London, and the whole board could prove it. Then he held up his hand, showing off his wedding ring, saying he was married to the love of his life. My head was spinning. I knew Helena and Carl had the evidence. I told them I needed my lawyer, but Margaret said that wasn't possible just then. She said outside contact might feed my delusions. It was completely surreal. The officer looked so uncomfortable, telling me he had a court order to take me to a place called Pinehurst for a 72-hour hold, and that we could do it the easy way or the hard way. I looked at their faces. Marcus, so full of fake concern. Margaret, cold as ice. The officer, looking like he was just sorry to be there. I'd been trapped. I asked if I could get my purse, if I could just say goodbye to you. But Margaret said no, that seeing you might be triggering for me. And honey, that was the moment. That was when I truly saw the entire monstrous picture. This wasn't about a divorce anymore. He was trying to have me declared insane, to erase me from your life completely, and I'd walked right into his trap. Pinehurst was one of those fancy places for wealthy people to hide their problems. It was beautiful, really, with manicured lawns and rooms like a hotel. The staff had these constant, soothing smiles, but it was a cage. For the first 24 hours, I was just numb. They took my phone, my clothes, and gave me these soft, gray sweatsuits to wear. They even took my wedding ring. A doctor, his name was Morris, he talked to me on the second day. He asked so gently why I thought I was there. I told him straight, because my husband was trying to take my daughter and my lawyer had sold me out. Dr. Morris just made a note. He said Marcus told him I'd been paranoid, thinking he was cheating. I said I had photographs. He had this kind, skeptical voice when he asked if I had them with me, if I could show him. Of course I couldn't. They'd taken my phone. He wanted to know what they showed, and I told him. My husband in Mexico with another woman. He just nodded slowly and said he'd already spoken to Marcus, who had shown him flight records proving he was in London on those exact dates. He had statements from Marcus's colleagues who were with him in meetings. He even had proof that the woman I mentioned was in Singapore at the time. I just said, that's impossible. But he suggested that maybe the stress of my pregnancy and the trauma of almost dying had clouded my judgment. He wasn't being cruel. That was the worst part. He really believed it. That's when I understood Marcus hadn't just lied. He'd built a whole false reality with documents and witnesses. I wasn't fighting a cheater anymore. I was fighting a system built to protect men like him. And it had just swallowed me whole. On the third day, I had a visitor. I was in the common room, just staring blankly at a television, when a nurse told me my mother-in-law was there. But I didn't have a mother-in-law. Marcus's mom died when he was 12. I walked to that visitor's room like a zombie, just waiting for the next nightmare. The woman at the table was a complete stranger. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and this incredibly elegant posture. "Rachel," she said, "please sit. We don't have much time." I asked who she was. "My name is Evelyn Grant," she told me. "I'm Victoria Chase's former mother-in-law." I sat down. Victoria was married to her son, Robert, for 3 years. Evelyn's voice was tight with anger when she said Victoria took him for $4 million and nearly ruined their family name. I told her I didn't understand. She said she'd been watching the news and recognized all the signs: the sudden psychiatric hold, the isolated wife, the husband acting all sympathetic. It was the same exact game plan she used on her son. Victoria did this before. Evelyn explained that Victoria Chase wasn't even her real name. It was Amber Jenkins, a con artist who had done this to at least 3 other wealthy men. She finds them, manipulates them into leaving their families, and then vanishes with their money. The world just started spinning again. I told her, "But Marcus isn't a victim. He was cheating on me." "Of course he was," she said grimly, "and he's also being played." Amber didn't just target the men. She studied the whole family, found men who were already unhappy, and gave them the perfect excuse to leave, all while setting herself up to get paid. I asked her why she was telling me all this. She said that when her son Robert finally woke up, it was too late. He'd lost his wife, his children, and a fortune. Her eyes were like steel. "I will not let another family be destroyed like mine was," she said, and slid a business card across the table. It was for a real lawyer, one who couldn't be bought. Then she stood up and told me not to let them make me think I was crazy, because the most terrifying thing about being gaslit is that it works. After the mandatory 72 hours, they had to release me. The doctor said I was under stress, but not psychotic. But when I went to the hospital to see you, security stopped me. They said my visitation rights had been restricted by the court. Restricted? You were my daughter. They said I had a court order for supervised visits, once a week. Just 1 hour, through the glass doors of the NICU, and I could see him in there, standing right next to your incubator. It was Marcus. He was holding you, smiling down at you, playing the perfect loving father for anyone who might be watching. I remember pounding on that glass and screaming his name until security had to escort me out of the hospital. Your Aunt Diane was waiting for me outside, just sobbing. She said she'd tried to call, tried to visit me, but they wouldn't let anyone in. I asked her about Helena, about the evidence. It was all gone. Diane told me Helena's firm dropped me. And Carl the PE, I said all his files, every single photo, had been stolen from his office. I couldn't believe it was possible. But Marcus had 3 days while I was locked away. 3 days was all he needed to buy off everyone and destroy everything. I ended up just collapsing on a bench outside the hospital. My legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. Just like that, I had no lawyer, no proof, no money, and worst of all, I couldn't even see my own daughter. Marcus had won. What am I going to do? I whispered to no one. Diane came and sat next to me, taking my hand in hers. You're going to fight, she said, and her voice was so firm. I don't know how just yet, but you're the strongest person I know. You are not going to let him take your baby. But first, I needed a place to sleep. My bank accounts were frozen. I couldn't go back to the house, and every single one of my credit cards was declined. I was married to a billionaire, and I couldn't even afford a motel room. You're staying with me, Diane said. My couch isn't much, but it's yours for as long as you need it. That night, lying on her worn-out sofa in that tiny apartment in Queens, I just stared up at the ceiling, trying to piece together how my entire life had just shattered. You know, when you have absolutely nothing left, there's a strange kind of peace. I had $47, a daughter I couldn't hold, and a husband who'd painted me as a lunatic to the world. It turns out that made me far more dangerous than he ever imagined. For the next 2 weeks, I was just adrift in sadness. I'd pump milk for a baby I wasn't allowed to see and apply for jobs I'd never get because my name was tied to his messy public life. Every lawyer I called hung up as soon as they heard the name Marcus Bennett. The whole system was built to break someone like me, and honey, it was working. But then, on a dreary Tuesday, everything shifted. Diane was at her job, and I was alone, scrolling through pointless job ads, when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting a soul. I'd really stopped expecting anything at all. I looked through the peephole and saw a face I knew. Victoria Chase. My hand shook on the doorknob. Every part of me wanted to keep it shut. This was the woman who had helped wreck my life, who was probably living in my house, sleeping in my bed, and playing mom to my baby. But I was too curious. I opened the door. In person, she looked nothing like the photos. She was thinner, so pale, with dark circles under her eyes that no fancy makeup could cover. She looked like she hadn't slept for days. I have to talk to you, she said. Can I come inside? Why on earth would I let you in? I asked. Because, she said, I can help you get Emma back. I just stared at her for a long time, and then I moved aside. She sat on Diane's sofa, holding a glass of water she never touched. My real name, she started, is Amber Jenkins. I'm a professional con artist. I've been playing this game for 8 years, she said. I could feel my jaw clench. You ruin families for a living? I find men who are already on a path to ruin their own families, she answered, her voice completely flat. I just speed it up and make sure I get a piece of the pie. It's not a justification, just what I do. Then why are you here? I asked. Because Marcus is different. What does that mean? She finally met my eyes. The other men were weak, vain, easy to fool. They cheated to feel important, left their wives for younger women. They were pitiful, but not dangerous. And Marcus? Marcus is a monster. Her voice cracked right then. I thought I was playing him, but he was playing me from the very beginning. I felt something change inside me then. It wasn't sympathy, not really. It was recognition. I knew exactly how it felt to think you held a few cards, only to find out you were just a pawn in someone else's game. What did he do? I asked. He put his hands on my throat last week, she said softly. He told me if I ever thought about leaving, he'd destroy me just like he destroyed you. And I believed him. I've seen what he's capable of. Why would he threaten you? I thought you two were getting married. Amber let out this bitter little laugh. There was never going to be a marriage. Marcus doesn't want a wife, he wants property. I was a useful tool for getting rid of you. Now that you're gone, I'm just another problem for him. It took me a second to put it all together. So, you're not here to say you're sorry. You're here because you need my help. I'm here, she said, because we need each other. Then she pulled out a little USB drive. I've recorded every conversation we've had for the last 6 months. It was my insurance policy. And believe me, Rachel, things have gotten very, very bad. What's on it? I asked. Everything. Marcus admitting he faked your medical records. Marcus and his mother plotting to frame you for fraud. Marcus talking about how to keep Emma from you for good. Amber slid the drive onto the table between us. It's enough to ruin him if we play our cards right. Listening to those recordings, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would break right out of my chest. There was his voice, so cold and businesslike, talking about me as if I were an obstacle to be managed, not a person he'd once promised to love. The postpartum psychosis story is perfect, I heard him say on one tape. Nobody doubts a mother's sanity after a difficult birth. We get a few doctors to sign off, and Rachel just becomes the crazy ex-wife you can't trust with a child. Then I heard her voice, Victoria's, asking, "And me? What's my part after this is all over?" "You'll be Emma's stepmother. Naturally," he'd said. "We'll wait a proper amount of time, but you understand the deal. You do your part, and you'll get a very nice reward." Then came his laugh, when she asked what would happen if I fought back. "With what? I've already paid off her lawyer, the PI is on my payroll, and once we get her committed for an evaluation, no one will ever believe a word she says." We listened for hours, Amber and I, piecing together a plan of destruction that went so far beyond a simple affair. He'd been planning to get rid of me before Emma was even conceived. My pregnancy just gave him the perfect cover story. That evening, Tyler and Diane came over to the little apartment. "Okay, wait a minute," Tyler said, pacing back and forth. "The woman who helped blow up my sister's life is now our star witness." "She's our only witness," I told him. "And she has proof that can actually end this." "How'd she get this proof?" Diane asked with her arms crossed. "By illegally recording conversations that probably won't even hold up in court." "It doesn't have to hold up in court," Amber said. "It just has to go public. Marcus's entire world is built on his image. Brilliant tech genius, loving family man, philanthropist. If these tapes get out, his investors will run, his board will oust him. His entire kingdom will fall apart. You want to leak it to the press?" I shook my head. "I want to give Marcus a choice, the same one he gave me. Give up everything, or watch your life go up in flames." Diane just looked at me. "Rachel, this is nuts. You're talking about blackmailing a very powerful man." "I'm talking about fighting fire with fire," I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. "He used his money and influence to crush me, to steal my child, and to call me crazy. Well, now I have the one thing he can't buy, the truth." Tyler looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and then he just nodded. "What do you need?" "I need you to help me get a meeting with Marcus. Alone." "That's completely insane," Diane said. "He'll have you arrested. You know, he could have had you committed again." Rachel said that was true, but she knew he wouldn't because she was about to give him a deal he couldn't possibly turn down. We decided to meet that Friday night, at a little restaurant in Greenwich. It was neutral territory, public enough that he couldn't try anything, but quiet enough to talk. I got there early, ordered a water, and just waited. Marcus strolled in right at 7 o'clock, looking like $1,000,000 in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He had this smug, almost playful smile on his face. "Rachel," he said, sliding into the booth, "I have to admit, I was surprised you called. My lawyers told me not to come." "I bet they did," I said. "They probably think I'm unstable, that this is some kind of setup." I remember smiling then. "Well, they're only half right." His own smile faltered for a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I told him, "that I'd spent the last month learning his rules, and honey, I was getting pretty good at his game." I took out my phone and played a little 30-second audio clip for him. It was one of Amber's recordings, and suddenly Marcus's voice was right there with us. "The postpartum psychosis angle is perfect," his voice said. "Nobody ever questions a new mother's mental state after a rough birth." I'll never forget the way the color drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. I just shrugged, trying to sound casual, almost bored. "Does it really matter? The thing is, I have 12 hours of recordings just like that one. You and Victoria, plotting everything. You admitting to fraud, talking about bribing officials." He tried to bluff, of course. "That's illegal evidence. It won't hold up in court." I leaned in a little closer then. "Maybe not," I said, "but I bet your investors would find it fascinating. Your board members. Or how about all those journalists who write those glowing articles about the brilliant young CEO with the perfect life? You're bluffing," he hissed. "Am I?" I pulled out a printed email. This is from Sarah Chen at the Wall Street Journal. She's been digging into scandals in the tech world. I told her I had quite the exclusive for her. I watched Marcus just stare at that piece of paper, and I could see his whole confident act starting to shatter. "What do you want?" he finally asked. So I laid it all out for him. Full and uncontested custody of Emma, the prenup thrown out, and $50 million, which I knew was less than he'd squirreled away offshore. "And Marcus," I said, "this is the most important part. You will never, ever contact me or our daughter again. No visits, no calls, nothing." He called it absurd. I called it the price of keeping his reputation. I stood up to leave. "You have until Monday at noon," I told him. "If I don't have the signed papers by then, those recordings go wide." I walked right out of that restaurant and didn't even look back. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition, but I held it together until I was alone in the car. The first thing I did was call Diane. "It's done," I told her. "Now, we just have to wait." That Monday morning came with this miserable, cold rain that felt like it matched my soul perfectly. I don't think I'd slept more than an hour or two since I'd seen him. Every time I shut my eyes, I'd just see his face. That moment his confidence broke, and you could see the gears turning in his head. I knew I'd backed him into a corner, and I knew cornered animals were the most dangerous. Then, at 11:45, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Documents signed. They're on their way to your lawyer now." I just stared at the words. I'd given him the name of a lawyer Evelyn had found for me, a man named David Stone, who was supposedly untouchable. Could it really be that easy? I called David right away. "Mr. Stone, it's Rachel Bennett. Did you get anything from my husband?" "I did," he said, and his voice sounded so wary. "Mrs. Bennett, these papers grant you everything you wanted. Full custody, the prenup is voided, a $50 million settlement." I just started crying. The relief was so overwhelming. "So it actually worked? He gave in?" "It would appear so," he said. "But Mrs. Bennett, you need to listen to me. I've been a lawyer for 30 years, and men like your husband don't just give up this easily. I asked him what he meant. I'm saying be careful, he warned. Read every single word before you sign a thing, and please watch your back. That night, I went over to Diane's to celebrate. She had champagne, Tyler ordered pizza, and even Amber was there, looking a little nervous, but also hopeful. To getting your life back, Diane toasted. To Emma, Tyler added, who finally gets her mom back for good. I smiled, I really did. But deep down, something felt wrong. It was all too neat, too simple. Marcus Bennett wasn't the type to lose. He certainly wasn't the type to hand over $50 million without a fight. What was I missing? The answer arrived at 9:17 with a loud, heavy banging on Diane's front door. NYPD, open up! Diane went white as a sheet. What on earth? Tyler stood in front of the door, trying to block it. Here, do you have a warrant? One of them yelled back. We do. Open the door, or we're coming through it. So we opened it. 3 officers came in, and behind them was a detective who had the kind of tired eyes that had seen it all. Rachel Morrison Bennett? He asked, holding up his badge. You're under arrest for wire fraud and extortion. My whole world just seemed to tip sideways. What? We have evidence you tried to blackmail Marcus Bennett with illegally obtained recordings, he said, and that you conspired with an Amber Jenkins to defraud his company. I just kept saying, that's insane. I didn't defraud anyone. Tell it to the judge, he said, and then nodded to the other officers. Cuff her. As I felt that cold metal lock around my wrists, I looked over at Amber. She was just standing there, frozen, staring at the floor. I couldn't figure out her expression at all. You, I whispered, you set me up. She finally looked at me, and her eyes were full of tears. I'm so sorry, Rachel. He threatened my family, my mom, my sister. I didn't have a choice. The recordings were real, she explained, but he'd edited them. He'd cut out all the parts that incriminated him and spliced things together to make me sound like the criminal. I felt the very last bit of my hope just turn to dust. I had trusted her. I thought we were in it together, that I finally had the upper hand. But Marcus had been playing a different game all along, and he was always 3 steps ahead. They led me out of the apartment. I could hear Diane yelling at the detective and Tyler saying he was calling a lawyer, but their voices just faded away as they put me in the back of the squad car. Through the window, I saw Amber one last time, standing in the doorway. Just before the car drove off, I saw her mouth 2 words to me. I'm sorry. The holding cell down at the Manhattan Detention Center was exactly as awful as you'd imagine. Cold, gray, and it smelled of pure misery. I just sat on a metal bench with my head in my hands, trying to make sense of how it had all gone so terribly wrong. I was so close. I had the papers, custody of my daughter, and now I was looking at federal charges that could send me away for years. Around 2 in the morning, a guard showed up at my cell. Bennett, you've got a visitor. I followed him to a visiting room, figuring it had to be David Stone, or maybe Diane. But the woman sitting there was a complete stranger. She was probably in her 60s, with elegant silver hair, looking impossibly put together for that time of night under those awful fluorescent lights. Mrs. Bennett, she said. My name is Margaret Bennett. I'm Marcus's mother. I just froze. Marcus had always told me his mother was dead. He tells everyone that, she said, as if reading my mind. It's easier than explaining why I refuse to have anything to do with him. She pointed to the chair across from her. Please, sit down. We don't have much time. Why are you here? I asked. Because, she said, my son has become a monster, and I will not stand by while he destroys another innocent woman. I sat down, my head just spinning. Another woman? Marcus's first wife, Margaret explained. Elizabeth. She died in a car accident 8 years ago. At least, That's what the police report says. And the unofficial story? Elizabeth was trying to leave him, she said. She had proof of his affairs, his financial crimes, the abuse. She was planning to take their son and just disappear. Margaret's voice was so heavy with a grief that was obviously still very fresh. She died 2 weeks before their divorce was final. A single car accident on a wet road with no witnesses. I had to ask, "You think Marcus killed her?" "I think my son," she said, "is capable of absolutely anything to protect his empire. And Rachel," she leaned forward, her eyes locking on mine, "I think you are in far more danger than you realize." I told her I was already in jail. "Those charges will vanish," Margaret said dismissively. "That's not his real plan. This arrest is just a show, a way to keep you locked up and out of the way while he finishes his real plan." Then she told me the most shocking thing of all. Amber Jenkins was never working for Marcus. She was working for me. She slid a thick folder across the table. "I have been collecting evidence against my own son for years, just waiting for the right time to finally bring him down. And Rachel, that moment is now." Just like she said, 72 hours later, all the federal charges against me were dropped. The official reason they gave was insufficient evidence. But the real story was so much more than that. It turned out Margaret Bennett had spent 20 years building a secret case against her son. She had everything: financial records, statements from people he'd hurt, proof of bribery and fraud, and worse, it was evidence he could never buy his way out of because he didn't even know it existed. And after all that time, she was finally ready to use it. I remember sitting in David Stone's office with Margaret, Tyler, and Diane, and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. "I don't understand," I said to her. "Why now? Why me?" "Because," Margaret told me, "you were the first one who fought back hard enough to make it through. Elizabeth, his first wife, she gave up when it got too hard. The others he hurt just took the money he offered and signed papers to stay quiet. But you refused to stop, even when it looked like you were going to lose everything. She could have just let him destroy me, you know. But that was the thing about her son. It was actually his mother, Margaret, whose voice hardened when she explained it. He has to win completely. He doesn't leave loose ends. If you had just taken a payout and disappeared, he might have let you be. But you stood up to him. You challenged him. That means he'll never stop until you are utterly ruined. So what's our move?" I asked. "We ruin him first." The plan she laid out was brilliant. Marcus's power was all tied up in his reputation, this image of an ethical boy, wonder who built an empire on hard work, but it was all a house of cards. His company was founded on stolen ideas, partnerships built with bribes, and competitors illegally squeezed out. And right in the middle was Marcus, a man who had never once played by the rules. "I have the documents," Margaret told us. "Patents he stole, contracts he got through extortion, financial records that show years of fraud." "Why didn't you ever use these before?" I had to ask. "Because I was terrified." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Marcus has power and money I could never fight. If I tried and lost, he would have destroyed me, and there'd be no one left to stop him." "What made you change your mind?" I asked. "You did," she said, looking right at me. "You proved that fighting back is possible, that the system can work if you're just brave enough to push it." The press conference was on a Tuesday, right on the steps of the federal courthouse. Margaret stood at the podium, surrounded by lawyers and reporters. Behind her, huge screens showed all the proof she'd been gathering for 20 years. I watched it all from a coffee shop across the street, with Emma finally back in my arms. The court had reversed the custody order 3 days earlier, citing evidence of fraud. I think I cried for a solid hour when they finally handed her back to me. And now, I was watching a mother take down her own son. You know, my love, it was his own mother, Margaret, who finally brought it all down. He'd spent 20 years building that shiny image, and she tore it down in a single press conference. I remember watching the screens fill up with all his secrets. Stolen ideas, fake contracts, payoffs. It was so much that no lawyer on earth could have cleaned it up. Then she announced she was giving the police evidence about Elizabeth's death, my predecessor. That it wasn't an accident. The room just exploded, and somewhere, Marcus was watching his whole world burn. They picked him up that afternoon, trying to get on a jet to some country that wouldn't send him back, seeing him in handcuffs on TV. The genius, the family man, the big shot. He was just another cornered man trying to run. I watched it all from Diane's place, holding Emma, who was sleeping right through it. Tyler asked me how I felt, and you know, I thought I'd feel happy, maybe even triumphant. Instead, I just felt empty, so tired. It was a strange kind of sad. I told him I just wanted it to be over, to stop having Marcus Bennett take up every bit of space in my head. I wanted a life that was just mine. And Diane said, "So do it. Take the settlement, take your daughter, and build something beautiful." The divorce went through about 6 weeks after that. I got full custody of Emma, and because of all the fraud, a settlement of $120 million. It was a staggering amount of money, but what I really got was my freedom. I remember that sunny April morning, loading the last box into a truck outside Diane's. I was heading to Vermont. I'd found a little farmhouse with a big yard for Emma in a small town where nobody would ever know my story. Tyler asked if I was sure, if I shouldn't stay near family, but I just smiled. I needed a clean slate, a place where I wasn't Rachel Bennett, just Rachel Morrison, Emma's mom. Diane gave me the biggest hug. She made me promise to visit and call and send pictures of Emma every single day, and I promised. Getting in the car, with Emma all buckled in, I drove away from that city. In the rearview mirror, Manhattan got smaller and smaller until it was gone. Ahead of me was a road I'd never seen, a future I couldn't imagine. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of hope. A year later, it was me, Rachel Morrison, standing on the porch of my farmhouse in Vermont, watching the sunset. Emma was 2 by then, a sturdy little toddler chasing fireflies in the yard, their little lights blinking on and off. Her laughter, honey, was the purest sound, untouched by all the darkness of her first year. I kept my promise to Diane, calling every week and sending endless photos. We'd drive back to New York a couple of times a year so Emma would know her aunt and uncle. But Vermont was our home. I was teaching English at the local high school. The kids just knew me as Mrs. Morrison, the teacher who always had a minute to listen, who seemed to get what it was like when the world felt like it was against you. They didn't know anything about the billionaire or the betrayal. They just knew I was kind. Tyler would visit every few months with Diane crammed into the passenger seat of his truck. I remember Diane saying, watching Emma play, that I could have stayed in the city, lived a life of luxury with nannies, and never worked again. I just shook my head. That was never the life I wanted. I'd just gotten a little lost for a while. I gave most of the settlement away to charities. I kept enough to be comfortable, to make sure Emma would be okay, but not so much that it would change me. The old Rachel, the one who clipped coupons and valued a hard day's work, she was back, just a little stronger this time. That night, after Tyler and Diane were asleep, I sat on the porch with the baby monitor. The sky was so full of stars, the way you never see in the city, and then my phone buzzed. It was an email from Margaret Bennett. The subject just said, Update. It said, Rachel, I wanted you to know Marcus's trial is over. Yesterday. Guilty on everything. The judge gave him 25 years, no parole. She wrote, I testified against my own son. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was the right thing. She said Elizabeth deserved justice, that I deserved it, and that the world needed to know the truth. She hoped Emma and I were thriving, that I'd found peace. And she told me, you are stronger than you know, Rachel. Never forget that. It was signed with respect and admiration. I read it through twice, and then I deleted it. Marcus was in the past. He didn't get to live in my present. Then, 6 months later, on a crisp fall morning, I was grading papers when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the window, I saw a delivery truck in the driveway and a man in a uniform on the porch with a small package. I opened the door. He just said it was for Rachel Morrison and asked me to sign. I took the box. It was so light, barely anything in it, and no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was a beach with palm trees and beautiful blue water, and standing there was Marcus Bennett, holding a baby boy. On the back, in his handwriting, were 4 words. See you soon, Rachel. I just stood there in my kitchen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. He was supposed to be in prison, 25 years, but that was him. Same face, same arrogant way of standing, same coldness in his eyes. My hands were shaking when I called David Stone. I said, Mr. Stone, it's Rachel Morrison. I need to know, is Marcus Bennett still in prison? There was this long silence. He said, Mrs. Morrison, I'm afraid I have some very difficult news. Apparently, there had been an incident. During a prison transport 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had escaped. I asked how that was even possible. He'd had help, of course, both inside and out. They believed he'd been planning it for months. They had no idea where he was. He was out of the country, somewhere they couldn't touch him. The FBI was looking, but with his money, he could be anywhere. I felt that old, familiar feeling, like the floor was dropping away from me. But this time was different. I wasn't alone. I wasn't helpless, and I wasn't afraid. I looked out at Emma, playing so happily in the yard. Then I looked at that picture again, at the threat it was sending. See you soon. He wanted me to run. He wanted me to spend my whole life afraid. He expected me to be that same scared girl. I picked up the phone again. Tyler, I said when he answered, I need you to come to Vermont. We have a problem. He asked what kind of problem. I told him, the kind that doesn't go away on its own. My voice was calm. Marcus is out. He sent me a message. I heard him curse. I'll be there tonight, he said. I told him to bring Diane and to pack for a long stay. After I hung up, I just watched Emma for a minute, so innocent of the shadow that had just fallen over us. The old me would have run. I would have grabbed her and just disappeared, started over again somewhere new. But the old me was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived so much: betrayal, lies, being locked away. A woman who had learned that running just puts off the inevitable. If Marcus Bennett wanted a fight, well, I would give him a war. I went to my closet and pulled down a box I hadn't touched since I moved. Inside was all the insurance Margaret had given me. Files and documents, evidence of other crimes Marcus had committed, other people he'd hurt, other secrets he'd buried. It was enough to make sure that even if the law couldn't touch him, his empire would crumble, enough to turn every person he'd ever wronged into my ally. I brought that box to the kitchen table and started sorting through it. The fairy tale was long over. It ended the day I woke up on that marble floor. But my real story, our story, was just getting started. And this time, I was going to be the one to write the ending. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky all these beautiful colors. And inside, I was on the phone, calling lawyers and journalists and other women he had hurt over the years. I was building an army, a plan, something strong enough to protect my daughter forever. Because that's what mothers do, you see. They fight, they survive, and they never, ever give up. I looked over at Emma one last time, just memorizing the way the light hit her hair, the sweet sound of her laugh. I whispered, "I will protect you, no matter what." Then I got back to work. The war for our future was on, and I was ready. It just goes to show you something powerful people never want you to believe. The truth always finds a way out. It can't be bought, or buried, or silenced. But my victory wasn't just for me. You see, that story was for every woman who was ever made to feel insane for simply believing her own gut. It was for every mother who fought like a lion for her child against impossible odds, to show her that winning can happen. It was for anyone who has ever been steamrolled by someone bigger and more powerful, as proof that the system can bend toward justice if you just refuse to break. I didn't just save myself, sweetheart. I hope I helped light a path for others to find their way out of the dark. And that's why I tell you this story. People need to know which moments matter. Was it the moment of betrayal? The quiet click of a recording starting? Or was it the moment someone finally stood up and simply said, "No more"? Those little moments, you see, they build a community of hope. You see, honey, this is a place where survivors can connect, where people fighting their own battles realize they aren't alone. I want you to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Not because you think they're in Rachel's exact spot, but because knowing these things is a form of protection. The more we understand how people can manipulate situations, the less power those kinds of people have. And if you're new here, please join our family. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because next week we have another story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about trust, betrayal, and the cost of standing up for yourself. Always remember this. You are stronger than anyone who tries to tear you down. You are smarter than those who look down on you. And you are far braver than you think. Until we talk again, keep fighting for what's right. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community